Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about tighten up our forms. Now, what do I mean by tighten up the forms? I mean by making them user-friendly, validation checks, only showing fields when they're necessary. And you also learn why I stopped using required on site column. Okay, so in this section of the series, what we're going to do is actually start to tighten up our parking request form in a sense to make it a little bit more user friendly, right? So as of right now, you have the badge number, start date are the only required fields, but actually we kind of need all of these fields to be required. And so we'll talk through that. We'll talk about the default date, when you do and do not want to modify those, and then some of the helper text. And then also like some of the formulas. So there's a ton of formulas. There's a ton of formula strategies. But one of the things that we will cover on this particular form is that if you're selecting one of these other options, you don't really need a special type other. The special type other should only display if other is selected under the special type category. So let's talk about some of the, and then these form fields, which I didn't go into detail in the first video in the series, but these site columns, like what is the best practice with naming these and display names and internal names and things like that. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing we want to do, let's go ahead and tighten up our form in the sense that I have PowerApps Studio open here. The start date. So this is the start date of when this request is needed for the requester, and we try to accommodate if we can. And if it's too near date in the future, we can adjust that. So what you can do, you can set the default value here for the start date, and instead of being the parent.default, you can do something like today. And this is not going to be enough, but your first initial reaction is to use the today function, which would just grab the current date and then set that as the default. But the problem that you can run into is that without some additional logic to accommodate what if this is an edit of a request, or you're trying to view the request, it will always show today's date regardless of what the date that the user selected, right? So in order to change that, you have to put some logic in there that says if the parent default is blank, so is blank, this is the syntax for that. So if the parent default is blank, then and only then use today, else use the parent.default, which is the value that's actually stored in the site column for this particular item. So that's the one piece. So if we go out here and test this out, again, I'm using my file, save, and then publish up because this is going to be a faster way for me to tweak and see changes. Hit the new form, do your control F5, so that way you send the latest and greatest, hit new again, and you see how it's defaulting to today's date. So if I put any arbitrary batch number in there, I have today's date. If I go in here, it defaults to today, but I really need this on the 20th, hit save, it saves the 20th, and if I go into edit, the 20th is there. If I go to this edit, the 7th is there, and now we're working as expected. And again, that extra logic is needed. So sometimes this trips people up to where they think they can just put in today and expect it to work as expected. But it has to be some little additional logic around that. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that notice that you have two, and I think terminology is a good place to go a little bit deep here. So if you just select the container, that's considered the data card, and within the data card you have the label, and then you have the actual control. In this scenario is the date control. I'm setting the default value on the date control and not the data card, because if you go into data card, there is a default here, which is actually looking at the site column name to set that as a default. You don't want to change it here. You actually want to change it on the actual date control. So I just wanted to clarify that piece of it. The other thing to kind of make this form user friendly is by default, you're going to have these input text placeholders, right? And it always defaults to find item. You kind of want to kind of keep it in context on what exactly are they looking for. And here it says find because there is a search capability there. But because our drop down is not, it's not like a people picker where they actually have to find a person. They're just going to select what that option is. So it's good to clarify exactly what you want them to do. So here you can say select parking lot, right, versus find item. And then for this special type, you can say select type. Again, it's just one of those things that when you're, we actually did one of these, and I had a UI UX expert kind of look at this and see what was user friendly. And the placeholder, the default, changing the default placeholder text was a good one. And then also adding default text of what you're expecting was a good one as well. So here under the text box is called hint text. And that's the thing, like depending on the control, it may be named something different. And some controls don't even have this option. But, you know, he also said that you want to give them an example of the type of information and the format that you're looking at. So let's just assume Tesla badge numbers are in this format, or maybe there are several numbers on the badge and this isn't the one that you're looking for and they all follow this format. So that's a good way to help them identify what exactly you're looking for. Okay, and this is normally used for like phone numbers or social security numbers or any other, if it's a number field, the format that you're expecting, that you can kind of help and hint at that. It's not 100%, but it's something, right? So the other one is, how do we deal with required fields? So with required fields, there's two ways you can do this. On the list itself, for each column, right, you can go in each one and make these required, right? So you just select the column, and then there's an option towards the end that says, actually it's towards the middle, require that this column contains information. What I do, I normally put these all to no. And that's just forward thinking and prepping you for success when you get into the Power Automate, aka the flow of automating the process behind this. Because if you go in here and set the required fields here on your data source, aka the SharePoint list, then when you go to simple things like, oh, I want to change this status from submitted to approve, or I want to update the approver for this, you then have to submit specify values for each one of those required fields, or else you get an error. So I've learned from that mistake, and I always do set my required fields in the PowerApps only and leave my site columns empty. So how do you do it in the PowerApps? So in the PowerApps, again, we talked about data cards and control. At the data card level, so really the bounding box, select that guy. And if you're not in there already, go ahead and hit advanced, hit unlock, and then just type in true right here where it says require. Again, you're going to do this at the data card level, and I think it's only available at the data card. So that would kind of help you. So if you have something else selected and you don't see it, just make sure that the data card is selected. So everything that we need required, I'm going to go ahead and set it here. Here, I'm not going to set it required, right? Because they may not select other. And if you set it required, something weird happens, especially when you hide this. The form won't allow you to submit because it says all required fields are not submitted. And the error message, unfortunately, is not that clean. It's something like data values invalid or something like that. It's really weird. But, you know, it's just one of those things that if it's a conditional item, you don't want to hard code it as required. You probably want to put some smarts behind it of when it will be required or not. All right, so that's how I handle require, and it works as expected, right? It's going to stop the user from proceeding if the required field is not selected. Once we get to the point where we're actually breaking this out into multiple forms, I will show you how that also helps you with multiple forms to ensure that the field values are selected before proceeding to the next step, if it's like a multiple form wizard type scenario. So here I did Control F5 to refresh until I saw my stars pop up. And now if I hit save, anything that's required is going to be highlighted in red, which is great. And it's going to force me to submit a value. hit save, and now I'm good to go. So it works as expected. It just sets you up for the future if you do this. And my recommendation, I highly recommend just to do this on at the Power App level versus at the site column level. All right. So the last one we want to do is how should we handle this scenario here, where if I hold down my Alt key, it allows me to select inside of that option and select different options. And I only want this to show if other is selected in this drop down, right? So in order to do that, the first thing I need to do is to go to this data card, and for the value that's stored here on this drop down, I always rename any data card or any control value that I'm using in the formula. It just makes your formulas a lot clearer to work with, and it makes it easy to maintain, because now you can kind of see which value is triggering what action. And the naming convention that I came up with is that I always prefix that with V as in value, and then the name of the site column or the data card. So in this case, it's going to be special type. So v.special type is where I'm selecting that value. And now for this data card, I just go to the visible property and say, instead of hard coding it to true, v.special type dot value are selected. And that's the thing, like when you're dealing with these controls, the formulas vary. So for the selected item, that value, if it equals other, then show it. Let's see if it's really that simple. Let's test it out. So I hold on my Alt key, handicap is selected, it's not there. EV selected, it's not there. And if I select other, it's there. Now if I select other, I want this required, right? So in order to do that, let me just copy this because it's the same logic. If that's selected, then make this required. And here is locked, right? And that's the thing, like certain properties you can modify without unlocking it, and other properties you have to unlock it first to modify. So if it's selected value equals other, then make it required. And that way, so if it's displayed, or if they have other selected, it's going to be required. Else if it's not going to be required, and it's going to allow them to go ahead and push it out. So let's confirm and make sure this works as expected. So I'm going to go ahead and save this off, publish this up to SharePoint. And again, like I said, PowerApps is very powerful because it modularizes, componentizes everything. And it's just a matter of you coming up with the right strategy to take advantage of the power of it. And like I said, initially when I started out back in like 2018, coming from a Nintex background, I was doing more like a Nintex strategy than a PowerApps strategy, and things just didn't make sense, or it wasn't clicking for me. All right, so let's do this. Let's do special type handicap, hit save, and allow me to save it, right? Let me just go ahead and put my type up here so that way I can easily see this without scrolling through. And that's the cool thing about these lists. These lists have really grown over time as well, as far as features and capabilities, to be able to just drag that over. And also, and notice here on my view, it saved it, right? And that was another big complaint, is that users were adjusting these and modifying these lists, and go out and come back in and notice that it wasn't saved because they forgot to come up here and explicitly save it. So Microsoft has changed that a bit. All right, so here I got handicap, no other, which is good. Now let's do the inverse. So now let's go through. I'm okay with today's state. Select my parking lot, select my type, and here I'm going to hit other, and then say I need a GMC charger or something along those lines, right? And then here the make, and then hit save, right? And now let's try it with other and see if it allows us to get past it without specifying an other description, right? That's the other thing you want to test. And that's the thing with these formulas. You want to make sure that you're testing all the scenarios, right? just to feel like you really got it and your logic is where it needs to be. You really want to test it out. So that's it. I mean, it's really that simple. And again, it wasn't that simple and intuitive when I first started. It's just creating several of these and going through maintenance cycles and understanding the gotchas and stuff like that. That it really caught. I'm starting to get into a pattern or a blueprint on how do I pull these off. Right. So the other thing that I really want to share, and we kind of skipped over it because it's cumbersome and time consuming, is creating your list. When you create your list, you want to, one, make sure that you're only adding in the information that you need and not just information that you don't need, right? Like the name of the person submitting their request or the date the request was submitted. You're going to get that by default with these four. So, leverage what you get out of the box, and you're going to have a created by, modified. You get all of that by default. I know exactly who created this and the time it was created, and I know who modified it, who's the last person to modify it, and when it was modified. I don't need to create other columns to track that, and that's pretty self-explanatory. The other one is when these column names are pretty simple, but you're going to get into scenarios where the column names are very verbose, they're very long, or they have special characters and stuff like that. I usually save those very long, verbose, user-friendly names for the Power App only, meaning that in the data card itself, there's a property called display name. So if this is model of the car needed or something like that, like if the business requirements say, hey, we need very descriptive field names, I'm not putting all of this in the site column name. I'm saving that for the Power App and using very simple descriptive name, not very descriptive, but very simple names here in the Power App, because these names are going to spill over into my Power Automate. And I don't want, you will see, like when you get in the Power Automate and start dealing with their expressions, aka the way that they use formulas to like see if a field name is empty and all this other stuff. If you have these very long, robust names, things get nasty real quick over there. So one, I keep the names here simple. And the other thing I do is that when I'm creating these names, I first create these column names without spaces, and you would notice this up in the URL. And this is just in habit coming from a SharePoint developer background and using REST API and stuff like that. I've always was in the habit of keeping these simple names. So if this process grows to where you have to call a custom API or a developer has to write an API against this list, you would do them a big favor by keeping these field names without site column names without spaces. And what that means is that you say, oh, well, you have a space here because I named it twice. When you first name it, that established the internal name, and you can't change this once you name it. Like if you typed it, or if this is a typo, you have to delete it and recreate it. There's no way you can change this internal name. The second piece is the user-friendly name that gets shown in the view and all this other stuff for the users, right? Those are going to be the user-friendly name. So an example of that would be the start date. So if I go back, let me just hit back on the browser and then hit start date, you will notice that this still does not have a space in it because I didn't come in here and touch it and add the space. And now when you're looking at the view, it has a nice space and it's user-friendly, but then again, it's developer-friendly because the internal name is not going to have a space in it. All right. Again, it's just one of those tips and tricks that I've learned over time, and it's really kind of like a pattern or a best practice that I kind of gravitate towards when creating these. All right. So, okay. So next in the video, now we have our parking requests. Let's get fancy, right? We know what all the make vehicles are to some extent. We know the models for those makes, right? And color is still open. So in the next video, let's talk about how do you solve this as a cascading drop down and having this list of making models in a separate SharePoint list and bringing that into your form. All right. So any questions or comments, leave that in the comment section. I'll take a look at them and reply back as soon as I can. Other than that, I'll chat with you soon. See you in the next video.